An innocent man fighting for his life. A corrupt system hiding in plain sight. When a seasoned officer's split-second decision sparks a wave of shocking revelations, a relentless district attorney takes on a battle for justice that will shake the foundations of his city. Will he uncover the truth before it's too late? Or will the darkness of corruption claim another victim? Stay tuned to uncover the story that's more than a fight for justice. It's a fight for change. The taser prongs remained embedded in his jacket, the faint smell of burned fabric lingering in the air. A woman stepped forward, her phone held high as she recorded. "Call an ambulance," she screamed, her voice cracking with urgency. "He's having a heart attack." Derek reached for his radio with trembling hands. "This is Officer Warren," he stammered, his voice barely steady. "I need medical assistance at Broad and Elm. Possible heart attack. Suspect down." Suspect. The word hung in the air like a curse. Even as he spoke it, Derek felt its weight, the lie behind it, the justification that wouldn't hold. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as paramedics rushed to the scene. The crowd continued to swell, their murmurs growing into a roar of outrage. People filmed from every angle, their voices carrying indignation and disbelief. "An old man! You tased an old man!" one voice rang out, laced with fury. Another added, "We all saw it. You didn't even give him a chance." When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics moved swiftly, lifting Caleb onto a stretcher. His pulse was weak, his breathing shallow. Derek tried to explain himself to his supervisor over the radio, his words fumbling and hollow. He wasn't complying, he muttered, but even he didn't believe it anymore. As the ambulance sped away, Derek stood alone, surrounded by a crowd that had already judged him. Their eyes bore into him, their phones capturing every moment of his downfall. In the back of his mind, a voice whispered the truth. This time, there's no sweeping it under the rug. The faint hum of fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor did little to soothe the storm brewing inside Elliot Turner. His polished shoes clicked against the linoleum floor, their sound sharp and unyielding, a contrast to the chaos of his thoughts. In his hand, his phone buzzed incessantly with updates he ignored. All that mattered now was reaching his father's room, but with every step, the weight of guilt pressed heavier on his chest. When Elliot reached the ICU door, he froze, the sterile scent of the hospital mingling with the memories he'd tried to suppress. Memories of arguments, silences, and the space that had grown between him and his father over the years. Caleb Turner, the man who had raised him to stand tall, now lay helpless, and Elliot hadn't been there when it mattered. The door opened before he could summon the courage to knock. His sister, Lila Turner, stood on the threshold, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of exhaustion and fury. Her dark curls framed a face that mirrored their father's, strong, unyielding, but worn by grief. "You finally showed up," Lila said, her voice clipped. Elliot sighed, already bracing for the confrontation he knew was coming. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, his tone measured but laced with guilt. "Did you?" Lila's eyes narrowed as she stepped aside, letting him into the room. "Or did someone have to remind you we exist?" Inside, the sight of Caleb hooked up to machines hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was a cruel reminder of his father's fragility. Tubes snaked from Caleb's arms, and his chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, the ventilator doing what his body could not. Elliot's throat tightened. "How is he?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila moved to the corner of the room, her arms still folded. "Stable for now. But the doctors say it's touch and go. They don't know if he'll pull through." Elliot ran a hand over his face, the weight of her words sinking in. "What happened exactly?" Lila's eyes flashed with anger. "You want the short version? A cop tased Dad for no reason, and now he's in here fighting for his life. That's what happened." Elliot shook his head, trying to process it. "A cop? Why? What was he doing?" "What he's always doing," Lila snapped. "Living his life, walking home from the pharmacy. You'd know that if you were around." The accusation hit its mark. Elliot turned to her, his jaw tightening. "This isn't about me." "Isn't it?" Lila shot back, stepping closer. "You moved to the city, buried yourself in your career, and left me to deal with everything. Now you're here, acting like you care because it looks bad if you don't." Elliot's eyes narrowed. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Lila let out a bitter laugh. "Dad's lying in a hospital bed because some cop thought he could get away with it, and you're more focused on how it affects you. What's not fair is that you're only here when things fall apart." The words cut deep. Elliot opened his mouth to respond but stopped when Caleb stirred slightly, a faint moan escaping his lips. Both siblings froze, their argument momentarily forgotten as they watched their father slip back into unconsciousness. Lila sighed, the fight draining from her. She moved back to her chair by Caleb's bedside. "You have no idea what it's been like, Elliot," she said softly. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to the air as the emergency room staff worked frantically. Monitors beeped in chaotic unison, their rhythm dissonant, as Caleb Turner lay lifeless on the gurney. His weathered face, marked by years of sacrifice and resilience, now looked frail, his chest rising and falling in irregular gasps. The once strong firefighter and Gulf War veteran was now at the mercy of the very system he had trusted to protect his community. "Clear!" the doctor shouted, his voice commanding but tinged with urgency. The paddles of the defibrillator discharged into Caleb's chest, making his body convulse violently. For a moment, silence filled the room, the kind that made time feel as if it had stopped. Then the monitor beeped once, twice, and resumed its erratic pulse. Relief swept through the medical team, though the battle was far from over. Outside, the waiting room buzzed with whispers, murmurs of confusion, and the soft hum of cell phones recording the scene. The crowd that had gathered earlier still lingered, their faces etched with shock and outrage. Videos from their phones had already hit social media, captions like "unarmed veteran tased by officer" spreading like wildfire. In one corner, a woman sobbed into her partner's shoulder. Across the room, a young man scrolled through his phone, watching and rewatching the footage of the confrontation that had left Caleb fighting for his life. A few hours earlier, the streets of Fairwater, a quiet industrial town, had been filled with the mundane hum of everyday life. Caleb Turner, clad in a weathered navy jacket and a well-worn cap, walked his usual route to the local pharmacy. His gait was slow but steady, his right hand clutching the paper bag containing his heart medication. At 71, Caleb was no stranger to routine. It gave him a sense of purpose and stability. The world outside might have changed, but his morning walk was sacred, his way of staying connected to a community he had once served. Today, however, the air was heavy with tension. Police sirens echoed in the distance, bouncing off the brick facades of Fairwater's modest storefronts. A robbery at a nearby convenience store had sent officers into a frenzy, searching for a suspect described as a man in dark clothing. Caleb, oblivious to the unfolding chaos, focused on his path home, his mind occupied with thoughts of his granddaughter's upcoming birthday. Officer Derek Warren, meanwhile, was on edge. His patrol car screeched to a halt at the corner of Broad and Elm Streets, the tires kicking up loose gravel. Derek's chest rose and fell in rapid breaths as he scanned the street. He was a cop with something to prove, always teetering between the desire to excel and the weight of self-doubt. Years of departmental pressure to deliver results, no matter the cost, had sharpened his instincts, but they had also blurred his judgment. And there he saw him. A man in a dark jacket, walking alone, carrying a bag. Caleb Turner. Derek's heart pounded as he stepped out of his car, one hand hovering near his holster. "Sir," he barked, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Stop right there." Caleb paused mid-step, his brow furrowing in confusion. He turned slowly, his hands gripping the paper bag tighter. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone calm but cautious. "You fit the description of a suspect. Hands where I can see them." Derek's voice rose, his fingers twitching near the handle of his taser. Caleb frowned. "Officer, there must be some mistake. I'm just walking home." "Don't move!" Derek shouted, his adrenaline drowning out reason. Every fiber of his being told him to take control, to act before something went wrong. but it was already going wrong. Caleb raised his hands slowly, the bag swinging from his wrist. "Look, I don't want any trouble. My ID's in my pocket. I can show you." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Derek yelled, stepping closer, his eyes darting to the bag. "What's in the bag?" Caleb's calm demeanor barely faltered. "It's my medication. I'm reaching for my ID now, all right?" But Derek wasn't listening. His vision tunneled, his ears ringing with imagined threats. Caleb's slow movement seemed deliberate, dangerous. In his panic, Derek reacted. The crackle of the taser firing cut through the air, followed by a collective gasp from the nearby sidewalk. Caleb's body convulsed violently before crumpling to the pavement. His head struck the concrete with a sickening thud, the white bag falling from his grasp and spilling its contents. Bottles of heart pills scattering across the ground. A beat of silence followed, broken only by the muffled cries of onlookers. "What the hell did you just do?" someone shouted from the growing crowd. "He wasn't even resisting." Derek's chest heaved as he stood frozen, the reality of his actions hitting him like a freight train. Caleb lay motionless, his face twisted in pain, his breaths shallow and labored. Watching him get older, weaker, knowing he's still trying to protect everyone but himself. Elliot stood silently, guilt gnawing at him. She wasn't wrong. He had distanced himself from their father after years of clashing over what Caleb saw as Elliot's lack of principles in pursuing a high-profile career. But now, none of that mattered. "I'll make this right," Elliot said finally, his voice steady. "I'll find out who did this, and I'll hold them accountable." Lila looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." At the precinct, Officer Derek Warren sat in a dimly lit office, staring at his computer screen. His unfinished report glared back at him, a blinking cursor mocking his inability to find the words. The sound of the incident replayed in his mind. The crackle of the taser, the thud of Caleb hitting the ground, the gasps of the crowd. "Still working on that?" a gruff voice interrupted. Derek looked up to see Sergeant Roy Carter leaning against the doorway. Roy was a broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard and an air of authority that made younger officers straighten up instinctively. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Yeah, Derek stammered, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. "I'm just trying to get it right." Roy smirked, pulling up a chair and sitting across from him. "Getting it right isn't the point, Warren. Getting it clean is." Derek swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I thought—" "Doesn't matter what you thought," Roy cut him off, his tone sharp. "What matters is what's on paper. You followed procedure. The suspect wasn't compliant. You used reasonable force. That's the story." Derek's chest tightened. "But the crowd, the videos—" "Let me worry about the videos," Roy said, leaning closer. "You worry about your report. Stick to the story or you're on your own." The words hung heavy in the air. Derek nodded, his gaze dropping to the desk. "Got it." Roy slapped the desk lightly, a signal that the conversation was over. "Good, finish it tonight. And remember, this didn't happen because you made a mistake. It happened because people like him don't know how to follow orders." As Roy left the room, Derek let out a shaky breath. He stared at the cursor on his screen, the words Roy had fed him forming in his mind. The suspect was uncooperative. The use of force was necessary. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he couldn't bring himself to type them. Not yet. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, and for the first time Derek wondered if this would be the mistake that would ruin him. Not because he had been caught, but because deep down, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he lied. Back at the hospital, Elliot sat alone in the waiting room, his head in his hands. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from one of his colleagues at the district attorney's office. "Seen the video yet?" it read. Elliot hesitated, then opened the link. As he watched the footage of his father's collapse, anger boiled beneath his grief. This wasn't just an accident or a misunderstanding. This was negligence. This was injustice, and someone was going to answer for it. The next morning, Elliot Turner sat in his office, the blinds drawn to block out the harsh sunlight. The dim glow of his laptop illuminated the room, but it did nothing to dispel the storm of anger brewing inside him. His father's pale face, hooked up to machines, haunted his thoughts. He hit play on the video of the incident for the fourth time, the scene etched into his memory but still fresh in its brutality. The shaky footage, taken from a bystander's phone, captured every second of the encounter. Caleb's calm attempts to explain, the officer's escalating shouts, the cruel sudden crackle of the taser. Then the silence, broken only by the horrified murmurs of the growing crowd as Caleb hit the ground. Elliot paused the video, his hand gripping the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It couldn't be. His gut told him there was more to uncover, and he wasn't going to stop until he had the answers. Later that day, Elliot met with his first witness, a young man named Jordan Price. Jordan, who had filmed the initial footage, was seated across from Elliot in the sterile conference room at the district attorney's office. He fidgeted with his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he replayed the events of that day in his mind. "I saw the whole thing," Jordan said, his voice shaky but determined. "Your dad wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't even walking fast. The cop just freaked out." "Did anyone else see it?" Elliot asked, his tone calm but firm. He leaned forward, his lawyer's instincts taking over. Jordan nodded. "A few people. There was this woman, Mia, I think. She's a reporter or something. She was asking people for statements." The name stuck with Elliot. He had heard it before, but he couldn't place it. "Did she say where she worked?" Elliot pressed. "Not really. Just that she wanted to get the truth out. But I think she knows more than she's saying. She seemed nervous." Elliot thanked Jordan for his time, but as he left the room, a new thread of curiosity had taken root. This Mia person wasn't just a reporter, she was a potential ally. It didn't take long to track her down. Mia Langston, an ambitious freelance journalist, was known for her hard-hitting exposés on corruption in small-town police departments. Elliot found her in a corner booth of a local diner, her laptop open and a half-empty cup of coffee beside her. "You must be Elliot Turner," she said, not looking up as he approached. "Took you long enough." Elliot raised an eyebrow, sliding into the seat across from her. "I didn't realize we were on a timer." Mia smirked, finally closing her laptop. "You're a DA, right? That means you're smart enough to know I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't think we could help each other." "Help each other how?" Elliot asked, his skepticism evident. "I've got footage and witness statements," Mia said, leaning forward. "More than what you've seen online, but I need access to records, complaints, internal reviews, things only someone in your position can get." "And what's in it for you?" "Exclusive coverage," Mia said without hesitation. "This case is big. I know it's not just about your father. It's about a pattern. Officers like Warren don't act alone, they're protected." Elliot studied her, weighing his options. He didn't fully trust her, but she was right about one thing. This wasn't just about Caleb. "Fine," he said after a pause, "but I get everything you've got. No holding back." Mia grinned. "Deal." Their partnership was uneasy but productive. Over the next few days, Elliot and Mia combed through evidence together, each piece more damning than the last. Mia shared raw footage from witnesses who hadn't yet gone public, videos showing Derek Warren berating and manhandling other civilians in the past. "These are just the ones brave enough to come forward," Mia said, scrolling through her files. "I've heard whispers about others, but they're too scared to talk." Elliot's jaw tightened as he reviewed a list of complaints filed against Derek over the years. Each one ended the same way: dismissed for lack of evidence. No follow-ups, no accountability. "It's a pattern," Elliot muttered, "and someone's been burying it." "You mean someone like Roy Carter?" Mia asked, raising an eyebrow. Elliot froze. "What do you know about him?" "Not much," Mia admitted, "but his name keeps coming up in conversations. Officers talk about him like he's untouchable. He's the guy they go to when things get messy." Elliot nodded grimly. He had heard the name before, though always in passing. Roy Carter was a senior officer with decades of experience and a reputation for keeping his department's image spotless. Too spotless. The more they dug, the more the threads unraveled. Late one evening, Mia burst into Elliot's office, her expression tight with urgency. "We've got a problem," she said, dropping a manila folder on his desk. Elliot opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. It was a series of emails and financial records, payouts made to civilians who had filed complaints against the department. Each payout was accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement, ensuring the silence of the victims. "These go back years," Mia said, pacing the room. "Every time a complaint is filed, Carter swoops in, cuts a deal, and buries it. And Warren's not the only one he's protected. There's a whole network here." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just about Derek's actions. It was about a system that enabled and protected officers like him. But before he could respond, Mia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her face paled. "What is it?" Elliot asked. She hesitated, then held up the phone. The message was brief but chilling. "Drop the story or you'll regret it." Elliot's stomach sank. The walls were closing in and the stakes had just gotten a lot higher. The weight of the past days sat heavily on Officer Derek Warren's shoulders. The bright morning light filtered through the blinds of his modest living room, but it felt harsh, exposing every crack in his resolve. Sitting at the kitchen table, he stared blankly at the untouched plate of breakfast his wife, Karen, had set in front of him. "You've got to eat something," Karen said softly, though her voice carried the edge of concern. Derek didn't answer. His thoughts were a chaotic mess, snippets of the incident, the backlash, and Sergeant Roy Carter's ominous instructions replayed endlessly in his mind. He picked up his coffee mug, but set it back down without taking a sip. His hands trembled too much to hold it steady. "Derek," Karen said again, this time more firmly. "Talk to me. What's going on?" Finally, he looked up, his eyes red from sleepless nights. "I don't know what to do, Karen. I messed up. Big time." Karen crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "The video's all over the news. People are calling for your badge. And now you're sitting here, acting like you can make it all go away by staying quiet." "I was following protocol," Derek muttered defensively, but even to his own ears, the words felt hollow. Karen's expression hardened. "Don't give me that. I've been with you long enough to know when you're hiding something. What really happened?" Derek hesitated, the lump in his throat growing heavier. He looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "I panicked. He wasn't doing anything, but I panicked. And Roy's telling me to keep my mouth shut. He says he'll take care of it." Karen's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room for a moment. "And you're just going to let him? Let him make this go away like it's nothing?" "I don't have a choice," Derek snapped, his voice cracking under the strain. "If I go against him, I'm done. I'll lose everything." Karen's gaze softened, but only slightly. She walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You already lost everything the second you pulled that trigger. But you don't have to lose yourself. You've got to do the right thing, Derek, before it's too late." Meanwhile, in a cramped office in the district attorney's building, Elliot Turner was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. On his desk, papers and folders were scattered, evidence of the growing mountain of corruption he and Mia Langston were uncovering. "We're running out of time, Mia," he said, frustration thick in his voice. "We need something concrete, something that ties Carter directly to these cover-ups." Mia's voice crackled through the phone. "I'm working on it, but Carter's smart. His name doesn't show up on any of the payouts we've found. He uses intermediaries, proxies. It's like trying to catch smoke." Elliot pinched the bridge of his nose, his frustration mounting. "There's got to be someone who knows how he operates, someone who's seen it firsthand." There was a pause on the line. Then Mia spoke carefully. "There is one person, Lucas Ward. He was one of Carter's guys, a rising star in the department until he suddenly quit a few years ago. Word is he saw something he couldn't ignore." Elliot frowned. "Why hasn't anyone talked to him?" "Because he doesn't want to be found," Mia replied. "But I've been asking around. I think I can get a message to him." "Do it," Elliot said firmly. "If he knows anything, we need to hear it." That evening, as Elliot reviewed files in his office, His phone buzzed with a message from Mia. Ward's agreed to meet. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., 62nd Street Diner. Elliot felt a flicker of hope. Lucas Ward could be the break they needed. Across town, Derek sat alone in his patrol car, parked in an empty lot. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, the leather creaking under his fingers. His conversation with Karen played over in his mind, her words echoing louder than the engine's faint hum. His phone vibrated on the passenger seat. It was Roy. Derek hesitated, then picked up. Yeah? You finish your report? Roy's voice was as calm as ever, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a warning. Yeah, Derek lied, glancing at the unfinished report still sitting in his email drafts. Good. Remember, you keep your head down and stick to the story. This'll all blow over. Derek's grip tightened. And if it doesn't? There was a pause, then Roy's voice dropped lower. It will, if you don't screw it up. You're not the first cop to make a mistake, Warren. Just follow my lead. As the call ended, Derek stared out the windshield, the weight of Roy's words settling heavily on his chest. The next evening, Elliot arrived at the 62nd Street Diner, scanning the booths for Lucas Ward. The place was nearly empty, the faint sound of a jukebox playing an old country tune in the background. Mia was already there, her laptop open and a cup of coffee untouched in front of her. Any sign of him? Elliot asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Mia shook her head. Not yet, but he'll come. They waited in tense silence, the minutes stretching into an hour. Finally, Mia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting to one of concern. It's from Ward, she said, handing the phone to Elliot. The message was brief and cryptic. Can't make it. Watch your back. Elliot's jaw tightened as he handed the phone back. What the hell does that mean? Mia shook her head, her brow furrowed. It means Carter's reach is longer than we thought. Elliot leaned back in the booth, his mind racing. Ward's disappearance wasn't just a setback, it was a warning. Whatever they were uncovering, it was dangerous. And now, more than ever, they had to tread carefully. The diner on the edge of Fairwater was nearly deserted, its neon sign flickering against the dark sky. Elliot Turner sat in a corner booth, his posture tense as he scanned the room. The message he'd received earlier still played in his mind. Meet me. No one can know. He checked his watch. Derek Warren was late. Moments later, the front door creaked open and Derek stepped inside, his face pale, his eyes darting around nervously. His uniform was gone, replaced by a hoodie and jeans. He looked more like a fugitive than an officer of the law. Elliot straightened as Derek approached, sliding into the booth without a word. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the weight of their shared knowledge hanging heavily between them. You're braver than I expected, Elliot said finally, his tone edged with bitterness. Derek's hands fidgeted on the table. I didn't come here to argue. Then why did you come? Derek glanced around the room before leaning in closer. Because this whole thing is spinning out of control. And if I don't say something now, it's going to bury me. Over the next hour, Derek spilled everything. Roy Carter, he explained, wasn't just a mentor. He was the architect of a corrupt system that rewarded loyalty and punished dissent. Officers under Carter's command were pushed to control the streets at any cost, often skirting or outright violating the rules. Complaints against them were routinely buried, and anyone who tried to resist found themselves reassigned, demoted, or worse. Carter tells us to make decisions fast, Derek said, his voice trembling. If we hesitate, we're weak. And if we're weak, we don't belong. Elliot leaned back, his expression hard. And Caleb? My father? Was he just another decision for you to make? Derek's face crumpled. I panicked. He wasn't resisting, but I thought he might be dangerous. That's not good enough, Elliot snapped. He's in a hospital bed because of you. I know, Derek hissed, his voice rising before he caught himself. I know, okay? I can't take it back. But I can give you this. He slid a flash drive across the table. It's everything. Internal memos, complaint records, even payouts. Carter authorized to keep people quiet. I've been collecting it for years. Elliot picked up the drive, turning it over in his hand. Why now? Why not come forward before? Derek shook his head. Because Carter protects his own, and he destroys anyone who steps out of line. You don't know what he's capable of. And you think this will make it right? No, Derek admitted. But it's the only thing I can do now. I need you to keep my name out of it. If Carter finds out I talked, I'm dead. Elliot stared at him, his anger simmering beneath the surface. You don't get to walk away from this, not unscathed. I'm not trying to, Derek said quietly. Just don't let him get away with it. Back at his office, Elliot plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The files were damning. Detailed records of cover-ups, emails from Carter instructing officers to alter reports, and a spreadsheet tracking payouts to silence victims. Elliot's chest tightened as he scrolled through the names. It wasn't just about his father, there were dozens of others, each a story of abuse swept under the rug. The sound of footsteps behind him startled him out of his focus. He turned to see Lila standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. Working late again? She asked, her tone softer than usual. Elliot sighed, gesturing to the files on his desk. It's not exactly a 9-to-5 job. Lila stepped closer, her eyes scanning the screen. What's all this? Evidence, Elliot said simply. Enough to bring down Carter and everyone under him. Lila's gaze lingered on the screen before shifting to her brother. I overheard you on the phone earlier. You've been digging into Dad's case, haven't you? Elliot nodded. Someone has to, and it's bigger than just Dad. It's the whole department. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Lila sat down, her expression thoughtful. You know he struggled after he retired, right? Dad always acted tough, but he wasn't okay. The nightmares, the guilt, it never really went away. Elliot frowned. Why didn't he say anything? Because he didn't want to burden us, Lila said with a small shrug. He thought he had to handle everything on his own. But he never stopped caring about us. Even when you two were fighting, he was proud of you, Elliot. Elliot's chest tightened, guilt gnawing at him. I should have been there for him. You're here now, Lila said, her voice firm. And if you're taking on Carter, then so am I. Elliot blinked, surprised. What? You heard me, Lila said. I'm not just sitting on the sidelines. Whatever you need, I'm in. The next morning, Elliot arrived at his office to find the door ajar. He frowned, stepping inside cautiously. His desk was a mess, papers scattered, drawers open, and his laptop missing. Damn it, he muttered, pulling out his phone to call security. But as he dialed, a folded piece of paper on his desk caught his eye. Unfolding it, he read the single line scrawled across it. This is your only warning. His stomach sank. The break-in wasn't random. It was a message. Mia arrived moments later, her face pale when she saw the scene. This wasn't just a warning, she said, her voice trembling. They're trying to scare you off. Well, it's not going to work, Elliot said, his jaw set. If they think they can intimidate me, they're wrong. But deep down, he knew the risks were escalating. Carter's reach was longer than he'd realized, and the fight ahead was only getting more dangerous. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the hum of whispers and clicking pens filling the air. Reporters lined the back row, their cameras poised to capture every moment of what had become the trial of the year. Elliot Turner sat at the prosecution's table, his jaw tight, his hands folded in front of him. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about justice, for Caleb and everyone who had suffered under Roy Carter's corrupt reign. At the defense table, Derek Warren looked like a shadow of himself. His usual confident posture was replaced by a slouched, defeated stance. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Derek barely responded, his gaze fixed on the polished wood of the table. Meanwhile, Roy sat a few chairs away, his expression unreadable, but his body language radiated defiance. The judge entered, the room rising and falling into silence as proceedings began. Elliot rose for his opening statement, his voice steady but firm. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today's case isn't just about a single act of police misconduct. It's about a system that allowed abuse to flourish, that silenced victims, and that endangered the very community it was sworn to protect. Officer Derek Warren and Sergeant Roy Carter are not anomalies. They are products of a culture of corruption that has gone unchecked for too long. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The evidence you'll see today will expose the depths of that corruption. And by the end of this trial, I believe you'll see that justice demands accountability. The first few days of the trial focused on establishing the facts of the case. Elliot called witnesses who had been present the day Caleb was tased. Each testimony painted a damning picture of Derek's actions. The unwarranted escalation, the excessive force, and the unnecessary use of a taser on an unarmed man. One witness, a middle-aged woman named Angela Reyes, described the scene in vivid detail. "He wasn't doing anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "He was just walking. And then the officer just tased him. It was like he didn't even care." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as Angela's words hung in the air. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer scribbling notes furiously. On the third day, Elliot introduced Mia Langston, whose investigation had unearthed critical evidence. She took the stand with confidence, her notes organized and her demeanor sharp. Elliot guided her through her testimony, careful to highlight the systemic nature of the corruption she'd uncovered. "Ms. Langston, can you explain what your investigation revealed about Sergeant Carter's role in these incidents?" Elliot asked. Mia nodded. "Carter has been orchestrating a cover-up operation for years. Complaints against officers were buried. Victims were paid off to stay silent. And officers who played by his rules were rewarded with promotions and protection." Elliot handed her a stack of documents. "Are these the financial records you obtained?" "Yes," Mia said, holding them up. "These show a pattern of payouts, hush money essentially, used to suppress complaints. The money didn't come from official channels. It was funneled through third-party accounts, all linked back to Sergeant Carter." The defense objected, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, but the judge overruled. Elliot could see the cracks beginning to form in Roy's stoic demeanor. Later that day, Elliot called Officer Lucas Ward to the stand. The former officer's appearance had been a surprise. After weeks of silence, he'd finally agreed to testify. Lucas's testimony was the most damning yet. "I worked under Carter for 3 years," Lucas began, his voice steady but tinged with bitterness. "At first, I believed in him. He seemed like the kind of leader we needed, someone who wouldn't let the streets get out of control. But I was wrong. He wasn't about justice. He was about power." Lucas detailed how Carter had pressured him and others to falsify reports, intimidate witnesses, and use excessive force to maintain control. "When I refused to go along with it anymore, he made my life hell. I left the force because I couldn't stomach what was happening." The courtroom was silent as Lucas described one incident where Carter had personally ordered a fabricated report to cover up a civilian's injuries caused by an officer. Elliot leaned forward. "Officer Ward, did you ever witness Sergeant Carter explicitly instructing officers to bury complaints?" "Yes," Lucas said firmly. "He didn't just instruct us, he demanded it, and anyone who didn't comply was pushed out." The turning point of the trial came when Elliot called Derek to the stand. The defense had resisted, but Derek's own guilt had led him to agree. As he took the stand, his hands trembled slightly, his face pale under the harsh courtroom lights. Elliot approached him cautiously. "Officer Warren, can you tell the court about your actions on the day of the incident involving Caleb Turner?" Derek hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tased him. I thought he was a threat, but he wasn't." "And why did you think he was a threat?" "I don't know," Derek admitted, his voice cracking. "I panicked. I let my fear get the better of me. And now, he's in the hospital because of me." Elliot stepped closer. "Was anyone instructing you to act this way? To escalate situations unnecessarily?" Derek swallowed hard. "Sergeant Carter always told us to take control. He said hesitation could get us killed. He made us believe that using force was the only way to stay safe." The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Derek as he continued. But it wasn't just that day. He covered for us, made sure complaints disappeared. He told us we could get away with anything, as long as we followed his lead. Tears welled in Derek's eyes as he turned toward Caleb's family. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed to say it. I'm sorry for what I did." Lila, sitting beside Elliot, clenched her fists. She didn't respond, but the emotion in her eyes was evident. As the trial neared its conclusion, Elliot delivered the final blow. A hidden financial trail linking Carter directly to the payouts. A forensic accountant testified that Carter had been skimming funds from department budgets, funneling them through shell accounts and using them to silence victims. "This," Elliot said, holding up the documents, "is proof that Sergeant Carter wasn't just complicit. He was the mastermind. He betrayed his badge, his community, and the very people he swore to protect." The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation as the jury filed back in. The judge's stern gaze followed them, her gavel resting unused, a symbol of the gravity of the moment. Elliot Turner sat at the prosecution's table, his fingers interlocked tightly. Next to him, Lila Turner kept her eyes fixed on the jury, her expression unreadable but tense. On the defense side, Derek Warren sat slumped in his chair, his once defiant posture reduced to resignation. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Derek barely reacted, his pale face betraying his exhaustion. Beside him, Roy Carter looked calm, too calm, as though the verdict were merely a formality. But Elliot knew better. Roy's unshakable demeanor was a mask, and cracks had begun to show during the trial. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room stood as the judge re-entered, taking her seat. The foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged woman with a composed but serious expression, stood and held the verdict slip in her hands. The courtroom collectively held its breath. "On the charge of excessive force," the foreperson began, her voice steady, "we find the defendant, Officer Derek Warren, guilty." A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. Derek's head dropped, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the words. Lila inhaled sharply, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "And on the charge of manslaughter," the foreperson continued, "we find the defendant, Officer Derek Warren, guilty." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and the clamor of reporters scrawling notes filled the air. The judge's gavel slammed down, demanding order, but the sense of triumph among the crowd was palpable. Justice, for Caleb and for others like him, had finally been served. As the noise subsided, the judge turned her attention to Roy Carter. "Sergeant Carter, based on the evidence presented in this trial, I am issuing a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice, embezzlement, and accessory to manslaughter." Roy's calm facade finally cracked. His jaw clenched, and his eyes darted to his lawyer, who began a heated but futile argument. The bailiff approached, handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights. "You'll regret this," Roy muttered as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. But his words carried no weight. His authority had crumbled, and the room no longer bowed to his power. Elliot watched as Roy was led out of the courtroom, his heart pounding. This was only the beginning. The fight for justice had claimed its first major victory, but the system that allowed men like Roy to thrive was far from dismantled. Outside the courthouse, the energy was electric. Protesters had gathered in the plaza, their signs held high. "Justice for Caleb. Reform now. No more silence." Their chants echoed across the city, a collective cry for accountability that couldn't be ignored. Mia Langston stood near the courthouse steps, microphone in hand, as a camera crew filmed her live report. "Today marks a turning point for Fairwater and potentially for police reform across the country," she said, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "With Derek Warren convicted and Roy Carter arrested, the system's cracks are finally being exposed. But as the crowd behind me reminds us, this is only the beginning." She turned to her cameraman as the segment ended, her phone buzzing with notifications. The footage she had released during the trial had gone viral, sparking debates on social media and coverage from major news outlets. The world was watching now. Back in the courthouse, Elliot sat with Lila in a quiet corner of the gallery. For the first time in weeks, the tension between them felt less like a barrier and more like a shared weight they had carried together. "You did it," Lila said softly, her voice a mix of relief and admiration. "We did it," Elliot corrected, glancing at her. "I couldn't have gotten through this without you." Lila managed a small smile. "I didn't think I'd ever see the day someone like Carter got what he deserved. It's overwhelming." Elliot nodded. "It's not over yet. There's still more to uncover, more people to hold accountable. But at least now, there's hope." That evening, Elliot returned to the hospital. His father, Caleb Turner, remained in critical condition, but there had been small signs of improvement. Tiny victories that gave Elliot a reason to believe in the fight ahead. As he sat by Caleb's bedside, he spoke quietly, recounting the events of the trial. "They got him, Dad. Carter's gone, and Warren's going to pay for what he did. I promised I'd get justice for you, and I kept that promise." Caleb stirred slightly, his fingers twitching against the bedsheet. Elliot's chest tightened. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. Meanwhile, across fair water, the impact of the trial was already being felt. Local officials faced mounting pressure to review the police department's policies, while activists organized town halls to push for systemic reform. Stories of misconduct, long buried, began to surface as victims found the courage to speak out. At the precinct, the mood was somber. Officers whispered among themselves, their loyalty to Carter splintering as his influence faded. Some expressed regret for their silence, while others remained defiant, clinging to the old ways. The department was a house divided, and change was inevitable. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the quiet hospital room, a constant reminder of the fragile line between life and loss. Elliot Turner sat beside his father's bed, the faint hum of the machines almost lulling him into a trance. It had been weeks since the trial, weeks of waiting, hoping, and refusing to give up. "Elliot," the voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it jolted Elliot out of his thoughts. His head snapped toward the bed, his heart racing. Caleb Turner's eyes were open, blinking slowly as they adjusted to the sterile light above. "Dad," Elliot said, leaning forward, his voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. "You're awake." Caleb's lips curled into a weak smile, his weathered face showing traces of his old strength. "Barely," he murmured, his voice raspy but warm. "But I'm still here." Elliot exhaled, a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lifting from his chest. "You scared us," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "We weren't sure if you'd—" "Don't finish that sentence," Caleb interrupted softly, a hint of his stubbornness breaking through. "I'm not going anywhere. Not yet." Lila appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw Caleb awake. "Dad," she said, rushing to his side. "You're back." Caleb's eyes softened as he looked between his two children. "You two. I haven't seen you this close in years." Lila exchanged a glance with Elliot, her expression a mix of guilt and gratitude. "We've had a lot to talk about," she admitted. For the next hour, they caught Caleb up on everything: the trial, the protests, and the conviction of Derek and Roy. Caleb listened intently, though the effort to stay awake was visibly taxing him. "So you did it," Caleb said finally, his voice quiet but filled with pride. "You stood up for what's right." Elliot nodded. "I had to, Dad. For you, for everyone." Caleb's gaze lingered on his son, his expression growing somber. "I wasn't always fair to you," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I pushed too hard, expected too much. I thought I was preparing you for the world, but I didn't realize I was pushing you away." "You were trying to protect me," Elliot replied, his throat tightening. "I get that now. And I'm sorry, too, for not understanding, for not being there when you needed me." Caleb reached out, his hand trembling as it rested on Elliot's. "We both made mistakes, but we're here now, and that's what matters." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion, but also freeing. For the first time in years, the distance between father and son seemed to dissolve, replaced by a mutual understanding and forgiveness. As Caleb drifted back to sleep, Lila and Elliot stepped out into the hallway. The tension that had once defined their relationship felt like a distant memory. "He's going to be okay," Lila said, her voice filled with hope. Elliot nodded. "We all are, but this isn't over. The system that did this to him is still out there. There's so much work left to do." "And you're not doing it alone," Lila said firmly. "We're in this together." Elliot gave her a small smile. "I never thought I'd hear you say that." "Well, don't get used to it," she teased lightly, though her sincerity shone through. "But seriously, Elliot, you're doing something important. Dad would have never admitted it before, but he's proud of you, and so am I." The words hit Elliot harder than he expected. "Thanks, Lila. That means a lot." A week later, Caleb was strong enough to leave the ICU, his recovery slow but steady. The Turner family gathered at his bedside for the first time in years, the room filled with warmth instead of tension. They laughed over old memories, shared stories of resilience, and promised to stay united moving forward. As the sun set outside the hospital window, Elliot found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. It had been brutal, filled with pain, anger, and uncertainty, but it had also been transformative. He had found strength he didn't know he had, mended relationships he thought were beyond repair, and uncovered truths that would change his city forever. Later that evening, Elliot stood on the steps of the courthouse, gazing out at the city. The protests had quieted, but the fight for reform was far from over. He knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult battle, but he was ready for it. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Turner," he said. The voice on the other end was low, cautious. "I need to talk to you. It's about another case, another cover-up." Elliot's grip on the phone tightened, a flicker of determination sparking in his chest. "I'm listening." The call ended with the promise of more revelations, more battles to fight. As Elliot stared out at the darkened city, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him. The system wasn't going to change overnight, but he was committed to the fight. For Caleb, for Fairwater, for justice. And so the story continued. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, reconciliation, and hope. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the system can truly change when individuals like Roy Carter are held accountable? Or is deeper reform needed to prevent corruption? How would you have handled Derek's guilt and confession if you were in Caleb's family's shoes? Would forgiveness come easily, or is justice enough? What steps do you think communities should take to ensure that voices like Caleb's are heard and protected in the future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to share this story with others who care about making a difference. Together, we can spark conversations that lead to change.